The sky over Willow County wore the soft gold of early autumn, and the wind carried the faint scent of dry grass and pine. Elijah Turner rode alone, his black stallion's hooves thudding a slow, steady rhythm against the hard earth. To most folks in town, Elijah was the kind of man stories were told about, the millionaire rancher who could buy half the county if he wanted. His sprawling Turner ranch stretched farther than the eye could see. His herds numbered in the thousands, and his word carried more weight than most men's law. But out here in the quiet valley below the hills, none of that mattered. He had come to the old creek not for business but for peace. This was where his father used to fish before the cancer took him. Elijah had been coming here since boyhood, and the whisper of water over smooth stones had always been a balm to him. Today, though, that peace was interrupted at first. He thought it was the wind, a soft broken sound carried across the valley, but as he drew nearer, it became unmistakable. Someone was crying. He dismounted, tying the reins loosely to a bent cottonwood, and followed the sound through the tall grass. His boots sank into the soft soil near the water's edge before he saw her. She was crouched low beside the creek, her head bowed, her hands clutching the torn hem of her skirt as though holding it down against an unseen force. Her dark hair, matted and tangled, fell in messy waves around her face, and her shoulders shook with each quiet sob. Elijah stopped a few paces away, uncertain whether his presence would startle her. "Missy," said gently. She flinched hard, spinning toward him, her eyes wide and sharp, the color of storm clouds locked onto his plait, and in them he saw something that froze him, not the embarrassment of being found crying, but raw, animal fear. He raised his hands slightly, palms open. "I didn't mean to sneak up on you. Are you hurt?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the words struck like a shot. "Please, don't lift my skirt." Elijah blinked, taken aback. He hadn't moved toward her, hadn't even considered touching her, but the plea was urgent, desperate. "I'm not," he began, but she cut him off with a violent shake of her head. "You don't understand," she said, her breath uneven. "If you see or look at me differently, everyone does." Her fingers dug into the fabric as though prying them away would take away her last defense. Elijah lowered himself to one knee, trying to catch her gaze again. "I'm not here to judge you, but you're bleeding. Your leg." "I said no," she snapped, her voice breaking at the edges. And then softer, almost to herself, "Please, just let me go." The wind picked up, ruffling the surface of the creek. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. Elijah studied her, the dirt on her skin, the faint swelling along her jaw, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to come crawling out of the trees. This wasn't a woman embarrassed over a torn dress. This was someone running from something, or someone. "I can leave you here," Elijah said slowly, "but I don't think you want to be alone. Whoever hurt you might come looking." Her lips trembled. For a moment, it seemed she might answer, but then she turned away, staring into the rippling water as if it could carry her somewhere else. Elijah's chest tightened. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But there was something in her voice, in that desperate plea, that wouldn't let him walk away. Somewhere deep in the trees, the sound of hooves drifted faintly toward them. The girl stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Elijah's hand instinctively dropped to the grip of the revolver at his hip. Whoever was coming, they weren't bringing good news. And though Elijah didn't know it yet, this was the moment. His life and hers would change forever. The distant beat of hooves grew louder, carrying through the still air like the pounding of a drum. The girl's entire body went rigid, her fingers clenching so tightly in the torn fabric of her skirt that her knuckles whitened. "They're coming," she whispered, the words more like a breath than a voice. Elijah stepped forward. "Who's coming?" Her head shook violently, dark strands of hair whipping across her face. "It doesn't matter. You can't be here. If they see you with me, she'll cut herself off." Biting her lip so hard he thought she might draw blood, Elijah straightened, his gaze drifting toward the tree line. Through the tangle of willow and cottonwood, the shadows of riders flickered. 2, maybe 3 men. Whoever they were riding fast. "You're hurt," Elijah said, lowering his voice, "and scared. That's not a combination that ends well. You need to come with me." Her eyes, those haunting storm gray eyes, locked on his, and for a moment he thought she might agree. But then she shook her head again, panic lacing every movement. "I can't go with you. You don't know who they are." "Then tell me." Her gaze darted back to the approaching riders, her breath quickening. "If I tell you, you won't help me anymore." "No one does." There was a weight in those words, a history behind them. Elijah felt a slow burn in his chest, not anger at her refusal, but at whatever kind of world had made her so certain that people wouldn't help. The hoofbeats grew louder, the shouts of the men carrying across the water. There by the creek, the girl's head snapped toward the sound, and in that instant Elijah saw it, the complete, unfiltered terror in her eyes. Not fear of a scolding, not fear of a stranger's judgment. This was the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly what would happen if you were caught, because it had happened before. "Get up," Elijah said, his voice leaving no room for argument. She hesitated, frozen between fight and flight. Elijah reached for her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that she could feel the steadiness in his grip. "I'm not them," he said quietly. But if we stay here, you'll be back in their hands in less than a minute, and I don't think you want that. For a heartbeat, she just stared at him. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she nodded. They scrambled toward his stallion, the ground soft and slippery underfoot. Elijah untied the reins in one motion, swung himself into the saddle, and extended his hand. Up, he said. She looked at the horse, then back toward the riders breaking through the trees. Her hesitation lasted only a second before she grasped his hand and let him pull her up behind him. The moment her arms wrapped around his waist, Elijah kicked the stallion into a hard gallop. The wind tore past them, the shouts of the riders chasing them across the valley. Elijah could hear the pounding of the other horses behind them, closer than he liked. His stallion was fast, but the ground was uneven, and the creek cut the valley like a scar. Hold on, he called over his shoulder. Her grip tightened. They crossed the creek in a spray of water, the stallion's hooves hammering the opposite bank. Behind them, the men shouted again, the words nearly lost in the rush of wind. Elijah didn't turn around. Every second wasted could mean the difference between escape and capture. Only when the sound of their pursuers began to fade did Elijah slow the stallion, his chest heaving as much from adrenaline as from exertion. He glanced down at the arms still wrapped tightly around him. You can let go now, he said gently, but she didn't, and though he didn't know her name, didn't know her past, Elijah felt the weight of a decision settle over him. Whatever danger she was running from, it had just become his problem too. The wind bit at Elijah's face as the stallion surged over the uneven terrain, muscles rippling under its glossy black coat. Every stride sent a jolt through the saddle, but Elijah didn't dare slow down. The girl clung to him, her cheek pressed against his back, her breathing fast and shallow. She didn't speak, didn't dare, and he could feel the tension in her grip, as if letting go would mean instant death. Behind them, the thunder of pursuit still echoed. The riders were persistent. Whoever they weren't content to let her vanish into the hills. The land here was treacherous, riddled with dry gullies and loose stones that could snap a horse's leg if you weren't careful. Elijah kept his eyes forward, searching for the narrow animal trail that wound up toward the ridge. If they could crest it, the path beyond would lead them straight into his property, a place few outsiders dared to trespass. A sharp whistle cut through the air. It came from behind. Thought the girl flinched. That's their call, she whispered, her voice trembling. They're signaling each other, Elijah asked. Yes, it means don't stop. He didn't need the translation. The sound carried the kind of cold, practiced coordination that spoke of men who'd hunted before and not just animals. The trail came into view, a sliver of packed earth winding steeply upward. Elijah urged the stallion onto it, the incline forcing their pace to slow. Hoofbeats behind them followed suit, climbing. They know this land, she murmured, her voice tight. Elijah didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. If she was right, that meant they might know where the trail ended too, and if they did, they could cut them off. Halfway up the ridge, a rock skittered down from above, clattering against the path just ahead of them. Elijah reined the stallion to a halt. The girl's grip tightened. What is it? Not a what, Elijah said, scanning the ridgeline. Who? A shadow shifted against the pale sky. Someone was up there then. Without warning, a man stepped into view, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that hid most of his face. His stance was deliberate, blocking the narrow trail entirely. Elijah Turner, the man called, his voice slow and mocking. Didn't think I'd see you out here babysitting strays. The girl stiffened behind him, her breath catching audibly. Elijah's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. She's not your concern. She's my boss's property, the man said flatly. And you've got something that belongs to us. The word property made Elijah's blood run hot. He didn't need the full story yet to know what kind of man referred to a woman that way. You've got two choices, the man continued. Hand her over now and ride away, or— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The glint of steel at his belt said enough. Elijah leaned slightly toward the girl. Hold tight. Then, with a sharp kick, the stallion lunged forward. The man on the ridge barely had time to step back before they barreled past, the stallion's flank brushing his coat. Shouts erupted behind them. The riders below were closing the gap again, and Elijah could hear them pushing their horses hard. The path leveled out as they reached the top, and the land opened into rolling pasture, the outer edge of Turner Ranch. Elijah didn't slow until the white fences came into view, stretching like sentinels across the horizon. He pushed the stallion through the gate, the familiar crunch of gravel underhoof, a small comfort. Only then did he pull the horse to a stop. The girl's arms loosened, but she didn't let go entirely. Why would you do that? She asked between breaths. Do what? Elijah said, glancing back toward the ridge. Risk yourself for me. You don't even know me. Elijah looked down at her, seeing the raw exhaustion in her face, and something else, a deep ingrained disbelief in kindness. Maybe I don't need to know you, he said quietly. Maybe it's enough that I know the kind of men who were chasing you. She didn't reply, but for the first time since he'd seen her by the creek, her gaze softened just a fraction. The Turner Ranch spread before them like a sea of gold, its tall autumn grass swaying under the afternoon sun. Elijah urged the stallion into a slower gait, letting the thundering in his chest settle. The white rail fences lined the road to the main house, a two-story structure of weathered timber and stone that had stood since his grandfather's day. To any stranger, it was a place of comfort, wide porches, rocking chairs, and the faint smell of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. But as Elijah dismounted, he noticed the way the girl's eyes darted everywhere, her shoulders tense as if invisible chains still held her. "You're safe here," he told her, reaching up to help her down. Her feet touched the ground, but she didn't move from his side. Her gaze swept the open land, the barns, the corral where a few hands were working. "No place is safe," she murmured. "Not for me." The words weren't loud, but they carried a certainty that made Elijah pause. He wanted to ask more, but the hard set of her jaw warned him not to push. "Not yet. Let's get you inside," he said. She followed him to the porch, her steps light and quick, as though afraid of being spotted in the open. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of coffee and fresh bread. Elijah gestured toward a chair at the big wooden table, but she hesitated at the doorway, her hands gripping the skirt again. "I'll stand," she said quietly. "Suit yourself," Elijah replied, moving to the cupboard for the first aid kit. He'd noticed the way she'd winced when dismounting, and though she was doing her best to hide it, she was injured. "You're hurt," he said, setting the kit on the table. "Let me clean whatever's bleeding before it gets worse." Her head snapped up, eyes flashing with something sharper than fear, almost panic. "No," she said quickly. "You can't see." The words carried a weight that made him still. It wasn't modesty, it wasn't vanity, it was desperation. Elijah studied her for a moment. "I'm not here to shame you, miss, but if there's a wound," I said. "No," she interrupted, the words trembling now. "Please, don't ask me again." Silence settled between them. From outside, the sound of distant hooves carried faintly, harmless. Likely just one of his ranch hands riding in from the far pasture, but she flinched, her body coiling like a startled deer. "You expecting them to come after you here?" Elijah asked. Her eyes flickered toward the window. "If he wants me badly enough, he will." He didn't know who he was yet, but Elijah felt the slow, steady burn of anger in his chest. Whoever this man was, he'd put that fear in her, carved it deep enough to make her doubt the safety of walls and fences. "All right," Elijah said, his voice even. "No questions for now, but you're staying here tonight. No arguments." She looked as if she might protest, but instead, her shoulders sagged, not in trust, but in exhaustion. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. "You're not." He meant it, though he could see she didn't believe him. Elijah showed her to the small guest room at the end of the hall, one that faced the pasture and the low ridge beyond. She stepped inside cautiously, scanning the corners, the windows, the single bed with its quilt folded neatly at the foot. "If you need anything," he said, pausing at the doorway, "call for me." She nodded, but when he turned away, he caught the reflection in the window, her hands gripping her skirt again, as though even in solitude she had to guard herself. Elijah returned to the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood by the window, looking out toward the ridge. Safe here or not, he knew one thing: the trouble that girl carried wasn't going to stop at his gates. The house was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that settles deep in the bones. Outside, the wind sighed through the cottonwoods, rattling the porch lantern. Elijah sat in his study, a half-finished ledger open in front of him, though his eyes had stopped reading long ago. He was thinking about her. She hadn't eaten much at supper, just picked at the bread and stew Maria, his cook, had set out. She'd barely spoken, her eyes constantly flicking to the windows as though she expected shadows to turn into threats. He didn't know her name, he didn't know the men who had chased her, but he knew enough to see the kind of fear that didn't fade with a locked door. It was close to midnight when the first sound reached him, a low, muffled cry. Elijah rose, his chair scraping against the wood floor. The sound came again, this time sharper, the kind of sound that came from someone trapped in a nightmare. He followed it down the hall, his boots silent on the worn runner. He pushed open the guest room door. She was tangled in the quilt, her hair damp with sweat, her lips moving in broken words he couldn't make out. Her hands gripped the fabric of her skirt, even in sleep, pulling it down tightly against her legs. "Miss," he said quietly, stepping inside. Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. She tried to sit up but winced, curling away. "You were dreaming," he said gently. "It's all right. You're safe." Her chest heaved, her hand still holding her skirt in that iron grip. "Elijah." Her voice cracked and she stopped herself. It was the first time she'd spoken his name, and hearing it made him pause. "I can't help you," he said slowly, "if you won't let me see what's wrong." She shook her head, tears spilling now. "If you see, you'll look at me the way they do, like I'm ruined, like I'm less than." "That's not true," he cut in, his voice firm. "Whatever's there, it doesn't make you less." Her gaze locked on his, searching for something, a lie, a crack, a hint of disgust that she was certain would come. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with trembling fingers, she loosened her grip on the skirt. The fabric lifted just enough to reveal her thigh, and Elijah's breath caught. Scars, deep, jagged, ugly scars that ran down the side of her leg to her calf. Some were older, faded to white, Others were angry and red, still healing. The pattern was unmistakable, not the work of an accident, but deliberate cruelty. The shape of them made his stomach not a branding iron. He exhaled slowly, forcing the rage down before it showed in his face. Who did this? Her eyes flickered away. A man who said he owned me when I tried to run. He mocked me, said it would remind me of where I belong. The words were flat, practiced, the way people speak when they've told their story too many times and it stopped sounding real even to them. Elijah knelt beside the bed, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence. You belong nowhere near a man like that. And if he comes here, I'll make sure he never touches you again. She gave a small, disbelieving laugh, not mocking but hollow. You don't know him. He's powerful. People in town look the other way. Some even help him. Then they'll have to go through me, Elijah said simply. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked at him without suspicion in her eyes. There was no trust yet, not fully, but something shifted. A thin crack in the walls she'd built. Elijah, she whispered, her voice trembling. I can't survive going back. You won't, he promised. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters again. But inside, for the first time, she loosened her grip on the skirt completely. The lamp on the bedside table cast a warm glow across the small room, softening the hard edges of the night. Elijah sat in the chair beside her bed, his elbows on his knees, waiting. He didn't rush her. He could tell she wasn't used to being listened to without interruption. Her fingers twisted the quilt as she stared down at it. My name is Clara, she began finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. Elijah nodded slowly, holding her gaze when she dared to meet it. I lived on the edge of Rainsford, she continued. With my father, he was sick, his lungs. I took in laundry, mended clothes, did whatever work folks would pay me for. We didn't have much, but we managed. Until she trailed off, swallowing hard. Until him, Elijah said gently. She gave a short nod. Martin Harlan owns half the freight lines in the county. Rich, respected at least in public. I didn't know what he was when I first met him. He came to our home, said he'd been watching me in town, said he could take care of me and my father if I agreed to be his wife. Elijah's hands clenched on his knees. He could already see where this was going. I told him no, Clara said. I didn't love him, and there was something in his eyes. Cold, calculating. I thought that would be the end of it. But the next week, our rent doubled. The week after that, my father's medicine supplier refused to sell to me. People I'd known my whole life wouldn't look me in the eye. He did that, Elijah asked. Clara nodded, to make me desperate, and it worked. My father got worse. I went to Harlan, begged for help. He agreed, on the condition that I live with him. Said marriage could wait until he decided I'd earned it. Elijah felt a sick twist in his gut. At first it was just rules, she went on. When I could leave the house, who I could speak to. Then he started talking about me like I was something he owned. When I tried to run the first time, he locked me in a storage shed for 2 days with no food. Her voice cracked then, but she pushed forward. The second time, he caught me before I got far. That's when she touched her leg briefly, not needing to finish. He said it would mark me forever. So even if I escaped, everyone would know I was his. Elijah's jaw tightened. And the men chasing you at the creek, his Clara said. He found out I slipped away yesterday. I've been walking ever since, keeping to the low ground, staying off the roads. I thought, maybe if I made it to the hills, I could find someone who didn't know him, someone who wouldn't send me back. She gave a bitter laugh, but I should have known better. He has eyes everywhere. Not here, Elijah said firmly. Not on my land. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as though weighing the truth in his voice. You don't understand, Elijah. He's not just a man, he's influence, money. People will lie for him, people will kill for him. I've faced men like that before, Elijah said, his tone calm but edged with steel. They all think their money makes them untouchable until someone reminds them it doesn't. Clara's lips parted slightly, as if to argue, but she stopped herself. You'd risk that for me. I already have, Elijah said. She stared at him for a long moment before her shoulders sagged. A mix of exhaustion and something else, something almost like hope. Elijah, she whispered, I can't go back. I won't survive it a third time. You won't go back, he promised. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to lean back against the pillows without gripping her skirt. Her eyes fluttered shut, the tension in her face easing just a little. Elijah stood quietly, pulling the blanket up over her shoulders as he stepped into the hall. The anger inside him had settled into something sharper, a decision. If Martin Harlan wanted Clara back, he'd have to come through Elijah Turner, and that would be his first and last mistake. The next morning broke cold and gray, the kind of dawn where even the cattle moved slow. Elijah was already in the barn, saddling his stallion. He moved with deliberate calm, but there was nothing casual about what he was about to do. Maria, his cook, appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. You're riding early? Got business in Rainsford, Elijah said, her eyes narrowed. Business or trouble? Same thing today. Maria didn't ask more, she'd known Elijah long enough to recognize the look in his eyes. By mid-morning he was in town. Rainsford was waking up, shopkeepers sweeping their steps, wagons rattling over the packed dirt street. People greeted him with nods and cautious smiles. Elijah was well respected here, but he wasn't the kind of man people invited into gossip lightly. He didn't waste time. Harlan's freight office sat at the far end of Main Street, a two-story brick building with polished windows, the kind of place meant to send a message. Money lives here. Elijah tied his stallion to the hitching post and walked through the front doors. The clerk behind the desk looked up, startled. "Mr. Turner, where's Harlan?" Elijah asked. The clerk stammered. "He's in his upstairs office." But Elijah didn't wait. His boots struck the stairs hard enough to echo. He didn't knock when he reached the office door, just turned the handle and stepped inside. Martin Harlan was exactly as Clara had described, tall, broad in the shoulders, his hair neatly combed, his suit pressed to perfection. But the first thing Elijah noticed wasn't his wealth, it was his eyes, cold and calculating, just like Clara had said. "Turner," Harlan said slowly, leaning back in his leather chair, "I hear you've been keeping company with something of mine." Elijah closed the door behind him. "She's not yours." Harlan smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Clara's under my protection." She wandered off. "My men were retrieving her when you interfered." "That's not protection," Elijah said flatly. "That's possession. And you're going to stop." Harlan's expression hardened. "You think you can walk in here and give me orders?" "I don't give orders," Elijah said. "I make promises. You come after her again, and I'll make sure you can't ride, walk, or draw breath without remembering my name." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Harlan laughed, low and mocking. "You think you scare me? I own half this county. The sheriff works for me. Men like me don't answer to men like you." Elijah stepped forward, placing both hands on the polished desk and leaning in until they were eye to eye. "Men like you think money buys immunity. But I've seen plenty of rich men laid in the ground because they pushed too far." Harlan's hand drifted toward the drawer at his right. Elijah's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Don't." Harlan froze. "Clara stays on my ranch," Elijah continued. "She's free. You set foot on my land. Send your men. Try to use your influence. I'll take it as a declaration. And you won't like my answer." The two men stared at each other for a long, heavy moment. Then Harlan leaned back, a slow, oily smile returning. "She'll come back on her own. They always do." Elijah straightened. "Not this time." He turned, walked to the door, and paused with his hand on the knob. "I'm not warning you twice, Harlan." Outside the street felt brighter, cleaner somehow. But Elijah knew better. Men like Harlan didn't give up easily. This wasn't over still. When he rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Clara was on the porch, watching the road with an expression Elijah couldn't quite read. When she saw him, her lips parted. "You went to him?" "I did," Elijah said. "Dismounting." Her gaze searched his, and he won't bother you again," Elijah said. She looked away, as if afraid to believe him. But there was the faintest tremor in her voice when she said, "Thank you." Elijah nodded once. "You're free now, Clara, and you always will be." The days after Elijah's confrontation with Harlan felt different, not just to Clara but to the whole ranch. It was as if the air itself had lightened, carrying the scent of fresh hay, wildflowers, and safety. For the first time in years, Clara slept through the night without waking in terror. No heavy footsteps outside her door, no shadows that looked too human, no hand gripping her arm in the dark. She began rising early, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She'd joined the ranch hands in the barn, helping to feed the horses or mend fences. They accepted her quietly at first, but soon with nods and friendly chatter. One afternoon, she found herself in the kitchen with Maria, rolling dough for biscuits. Maria paused, studying her. "You're smiling." Clara froze, touching her lips as if the expression might vanish if she acknowledged it. "I suppose I am. It looks good on you," Maria said softly. A week later, Elijah found Clara in the pasture, her skirt tucked slightly so she could kneel in the grass beside a newborn calf. Her hands were gentle, her laughter low and warm as she rubbed the calf's head. He leaned on the fence. "You're fitting in here." She looked up, the sun catching the auburn in her hair. "It feels like I've stepped into someone else's life, a better one. One I never thought I'd be allowed to live." "You're allowed," Elijah said. "More than allowed. You're welcome." She rose slowly, dusting her hands. "And what if Harlan changes his mind?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "Then he meets the side of me I didn't show him." The weeks stretched into a month. Harlan never came. Maybe Elijah's words had been enough. Or maybe Harlan had decided Clara wasn't worth the trouble now that she was out of his control. Either way, Clara began to believe that safety could last. Still, one evening she stood on the porch watching the horizon burn with the last of the sunset, and her thoughts tangled in the past. Elijah stepped beside her, the boards creaking under his boots. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what was it you didn't want me to see that night in the barn, when you told me not to lift your skirt?" She hesitated, fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. "It wasn't shame about me. It was about what it would show you, proof of everything he'd done. Scars, old and new." Elijah turned toward her, his voice low. Clara, I didn't need to see them to know the truth. But if you want me to, she shook her head. Not now, maybe someday. But I want you to know I'm more than those scars. And I think I'm starting to believe that again because of you. His eyes softened. You were always more than them. You just needed someone to remind you. Spring deepened, the ranch blooming into green pastures and clear skies. Clara learned to ride a horse properly, her hair flying in the wind as she galloped across the fields. She started planting a small garden behind the house, tomatoes, beans, and sunflowers. One afternoon, a letter arrived for her. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it slowly at the kitchen table. It was from her younger sister, the one she thought she'd never see again after Harlan separated them. The letter was short but full of hope. I'm safe now. I heard you got away. Maybe someday we can meet again. Until then, live free for both of us. Tears blurred Clara's vision. Elijah, passing through the kitchen, paused when he saw her. Good news? He asked. Clara nodded, smiling through her tears. The best, she's alive. In that moment, Clara realized something. Freedom wasn't just about leaving the place where she was hurt. It was about building a life where joy had room to grow, where the past couldn't smother the future. That night, she sat on the porch with Elijah. The stars spread across the sky like silver dust. Do you think people can really heal? She asked. I think healing's just learning how to live without letting the old wounds steer you, Elijah said. They don't disappear, but they stop driving the wagon. She smiled faintly. Then I think I'm on my way. They sat in comfortable silence after that. Two people who had walked through different kinds of storms, now sharing the same quiet night.